That sound is wrong. The words cut through the roar of the airport like a flare in the dark, sharp enough to turn heads, but not important enough for anyone to stop. At least, that's what everyone thought. The afternoon sun hung low over Charlotte Douglas International Airport, painting the tarmac in gold and copper. Ground crews moved between aircraft with practiced precision. Luggage carts rattled across concrete. Jet fuel lingered in the warm North Carolina air. And beyond a chain-link security fence, 13-year-old Elijah Carter stood frozen, staring at the narrow-body passenger jet preparing for departure. His fingers tightened around the worn baseball cap in his hands. The engine had just begun its startup sequence. A deep mechanical whine rolled across the runway. To everyone else, it sounded normal, routine, ordinary. But to Elijah, it sounded wrong. Terribly wrong. His heartbeat stumbled. The sound pulled something from the back of his memory, something he hadn't heard in years but had never forgotten. His father's voice. His father had been an aircraft systems engineer before a tragic accident took him away when Elijah was only 7. Long before that day, before hospitals and funeral flowers and quiet nights filled with unanswered questions, there had been evenings at the kitchen table. Evenings when his father would play recordings of aircraft engines and teach him how to listen. Not look. Listen. Every engine tells a story, his father used to say. If something's wrong, it'll whisper before it screams. Elijah remembered those words now. The engine's pitch climbed higher. The vibration carried across the hot pavement. Something about the rhythm felt uneven. Subtle. Hidden. But there. He looked toward the aircraft. Ground personnel continued their work without concern. The jet bridge had just pulled away. Passengers sat inside unaware. Everything appeared normal. Yet the uneasy feeling in Elijah's chest kept growing. No, he whispered. No, no, no. Then he saw movement near the cockpit windows. The captain, Captain Richard Collins, a respected veteran pilot with thousands of flight hours. Elijah had seen him before around the airport. Everyone spoke highly of him. Calm, experienced, confident. The kind of man people trusted without question. Elijah took off running along the fence line. Stop, he shouted. Don't start that engine. Several nearby workers glanced over. One exchanged an amused look with another. Elijah kept running. Please, don't do it. His voice cracked. The engine's whine grew louder. Captain Collins glanced down through the cockpit window and noticed the boy waving frantically near the perimeter. For a brief moment, their eyes met across the distance. The captain frowned. Then a smile spread across his face. Not cruel, just dismissive. The smile of a man certain he was witnessing a child's imagination at work. He gave a small chuckle and turned back toward the instrument panel. Elijah's stomach dropped. Please listen, he whispered. His hands trembled against the fence. The sunlight reflected from the aircraft's polished fuselage. Heat shimmered above the runway. Around him, nobody looked worried. Nobody looked concerned. The airport continued moving as if nothing unusual existed. Then 10 seconds later, every alarm inside the cockpit exploded to life. The cockpit instantly transformed from routine calm to controlled confusion. Sharp warning tones echoed through the flight deck. Amber and red indicators flashed across multiple displays. Captain Richard Collins straightened in his seat. The smile that had been on his face seconds earlier disappeared. His eyes moved rapidly from one instrument to another. The first officer beside him, Emma Brooks, leaned forward. That is not normal, she said quietly. Outside, ground crew stopped what they were doing and looked toward the aircraft. A maintenance supervisor reached for his radio. Near the fence, Elijah Carter watched the activity unfold. He did not feel proud. He did not feel victorious. If anything, the knot in his stomach tightened even more. He had hoped he was wrong. He wanted to be wrong. Around him, several airport workers were now staring in his direction, no longer amused by the teenager who had been shouting moments earlier. Yet Elijah barely noticed them. His mind had drifted somewhere else entirely. Long before, he became the quiet boy standing outside airport fences. He had been the son of a man who loved airplanes more than almost anything. Marcus Carter had never been a pilot. He had been something less visible and perhaps even more important. He was the engineer people called when problems refused to make sense. At home, his father filled shelves with technical manuals, aviation magazines, and notebooks packed with observations. Their small apartment in Charlotte often smelled faintly of coffee and printer paper. Some fathers taught baseball. Some taught fishing. Marcus taught listening. Elijah could still remember sitting at the kitchen table when he was 6 years old while his father played recordings through an old laptop. Different engines, different aircraft, different conditions. Marcus would close his eyes and ask, "What do you hear?" Elijah never knew the answer, but his father always smiled. "Keep listening," he would say. "Machines speak. Most people are just too busy to hear them." Those evenings had become Elijah's favorite memories, especially after his mother passed away when he was very young. His father had filled the silence with stories about airplanes crossing oceans and engineers solving impossible problems. Then one day, everything changed. A workplace accident took Marcus away before Elijah turned 8. The apartment became quieter than Elijah thought possible. The books remained. The recordings remained. The lessons remained. His grandmother Ruth moved in and did everything she could to keep life together. She worked long shifts cleaning airport offices, often leaving before sunrise and returning after dark. Whenever school ended, Elijah would meet her at the airport and wait until her shift finished. Over time, the airport became his second home. He knew the observation areas. He knew the schedules. He knew which aircraft usually arrived from Dallas, Chicago, and Denver. Most importantly, he kept listening. Every afternoon, he carried his father's old headphones in his backpack. While other kids watched videos on their phones, Elijah sat near the runways listening to recorded engine sounds that Marcus had saved years ago. Sometimes he imagined his father sitting beside him, pointing out tiny details hidden inside the noise. Tiny details nobody else seemed to notice. And now, standing beneath the bright Carolina sun as technicians rushed toward the aircraft, Elijah heard that same lesson echoing in his mind once more. Machines speak. Most people are just too busy to hear them. While technicians moved toward the aircraft, Captain Richard Collins remained seated in the cockpit, staring at the warning messages spread across the displays. The soft confidence that usually filled the flight deck had been replaced by something colder and far less comfortable. Uncertainty. Collins had spent nearly 26 years flying commercial aircraft across the United States. From winter storms over Chicago to turbulent summer skies above Texas, he had seen nearly everything a pilot could encounter. Younger pilots respected him. Airline executives trusted him. Passengers never knew his name, but thousands had safely reached their destinations because of decisions he made every day. Experience had become more than a skill. It had become part of his identity. That was why the boy outside the fence had barely registered in his mind at first. Airports were full of people who thought they knew something. Travelers pointed at clouds and predicted weather. Passengers worried about sounds that were perfectly normal. Aviation enthusiasts often mistook routine procedures for emergencies. Collins had learned long ago to filter out noise and trust training instead. Yet as maintenance crews continued inspecting the aircraft, an uncomfortable thought kept returning. The boy had reacted before any alarm sounded, before any warning appeared, before anyone else noticed a problem. Emma Brooks sat beside him reviewing system data. The glow from the screens reflected across her face. "Maintenance is requesting additional diagnostics," she said. Collins nodded. "Let them take whatever time they need." Outside the cockpit windows, airport vehicles gathered around the aircraft. Orange safety lights flashed across the pavement. A small crowd of ground personnel had formed near the engine. Through the glass, Collins could see heads turning and radios passing between supervisors. None of it looked routine anymore. He leaned back and exhaled slowly. His gaze drifted across the runway toward the distant fence line. The boy was still there, small against the massive airport backdrop. Waiting, watching. Collins frowned. He thought about his own son, now grown and living in Seattle. Years earlier, when his son was 13, he had spent entire afternoons asking questions about airplanes. Endless questions. Collins had often been too busy to answer them all. Looking back, he wished he had listened more carefully. "Captain," Emma said. "You okay?" Collins glanced toward her. "Just thinking. About the warnings? About that kid." Emma looked out the side window. "The one who was shouting?" Collins nodded. He sounded certain. A maintenance truck rolled to a stop beside the aircraft. Moments later, a senior engineer climbed out carrying a diagnostic tablet. Collins recognized him immediately. Daniel Ross, one of the airline's most respected maintenance specialists. Daniel was not the type to rush. He was not the type to overreact. If he looked concerned, there was usually a reason. Collins watched him disappear beneath the engine housing. Minutes passed. The afternoon sun continued sliding lower across the horizon. The cabin remained quiet. Passengers waited patiently inside the terminal after being asked to delay boarding completion. Then Collins noticed something he had not expected. Daniel emerged from beneath the engine and immediately called 2 additional technicians over. The engineer's expression had changed. Even from a distance, Collins could see it. The look of someone who had just found something important. Daniel Ross did not speak immediately. That alone made several people uneasy. The veteran engineer crouched beside the engine intake while 2 technicians held inspection lights steady. Reflections danced across polished metal surfaces deep inside the housing. Radios crackled. A baggage cart rolled past in the distance. Beyond the aircraft, the airport continued moving, but around gate C-17 the atmosphere had changed completely. Daniel narrowed his eyes and studied the readings on his tablet. Then he looked back into the engine. "Run the scan again," he said. One technician nodded and repeated the diagnostic sequence. Seconds later, the same abnormal data appeared. Daniel exhaled slowly. "I was hoping that was a sensor error." Nearby supervisors exchanged glances. Inside the cockpit, Captain Collins watched through the window as more personnel gathered around the aircraft. The scene felt strangely familiar. Years of flying had taught him that small problems often announce themselves quietly before becoming expensive delays. Yet something about this situation felt different. His thoughts kept returning to the teenager beyond the fence. The teenager who somehow knew something was wrong before sophisticated systems detected it. Outside, Elijah remained exactly where he had been. The chain-link fence pressed against his forearms as he watched every movement around the aircraft. He could not hear the conversations taking place near the engine, but he could read body language. His father had taught him that too. Engineers moved differently when they found real problems. They became focused, deliberate, careful. That was exactly what he was seeing now. The warm breeze carried the scent of jet fuel across the tarmac. Somewhere overhead, another aircraft crossed the sky, leaving a thin white trail against the blue. Elijah barely noticed. His attention never left the maintenance crew. A security officer approached from behind. "You cannot stay here much longer, son." Elijah turned politely. "Did they find something?" The officer hesitated. "I do not know." Elijah nodded and looked back toward the aircraft. Several moments later, Daniel Ross climbed the maintenance ladder and disappeared into the cockpit. Captain Collins stood as the engineer entered. One look at Daniel's face erased any remaining doubt. "What do we have?" Collins asked. Daniel set the tablet down on the center console. A loose calibration tool was left behind during overnight maintenance. Emma Brooks blinked. "Inside the engine?" Daniel nodded. "It shifted position during startup. Another minute, and it could have caused significant mechanical damage." Silence settled across the cockpit. Collins stared at him. "You are sure?" "Completely." Daniel tapped the screen. Detailed diagrams appeared. The warnings activated exactly when the object moved into the airflow path. Collins looked out the window toward the distant fence line again. The teenager was still standing there, waiting. Daniel followed his gaze. "Who is he?" Collins took a slow breath. "That is the question I have been asking myself." Far below, sunlight glimmered across the runway lights as afternoon slowly drifted toward evening. Around the aircraft, maintenance teams continued their inspections. Passengers remained inside the terminal unaware of how close the flight had come to departing, with a serious issue hidden deep within the engine. And standing alone beyond the fence, Elijah Carter felt a familiar sadness settle quietly into his chest. Because the explanation Daniel had just given sounded almost identical to one of the stories his father used to tell. The memory returned with startling clarity. Elijah had heard that story dozens of times while sitting across from his father at the kitchen table. Marcus Carter used to describe how the smallest oversight could create the biggest danger. Not because engineers were careless, but because people were human. A forgotten tool, a loose component, a missed notation in a maintenance log. Tiny details that most people would never notice. Marcus always said that aviation safety depended on thousands of people doing thousands of small things correctly every single day. Elijah stared at the aircraft and swallowed hard. The similarity felt impossible to ignore. The same type of problem, the same type of warning, the same lesson. Near the gate, airport supervisors continued discussing the situation. Passengers waited inside the terminal while airline representatives worked to explain the delay. The late afternoon sunlight stretched long shadows across the concrete. What had started as an ordinary departure had become the center of attention. A few minutes later, Ruth Carter appeared from a nearby service corridor, pushing a cleaning cart. Her shift had ended early after word spread about the unusual incident. The moment she spotted Elijah by the fence, concern filled her face. She parked the cart and hurried toward him. "There you are," she said softly. "I have been looking everywhere." Elijah looked up. "They found something." Ruth nodded. "People are talking about it." For a moment, neither spoke. The distant hum of airport activity filled the silence between them. Then Ruth placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "You did not get yourself into trouble, did you?" Elijah shook his head. "I just heard it." Ruth studied him carefully. She knew exactly what he meant. Over the years, she had watched her grandson inherit pieces of Marcus that no one could teach. The curiosity, the patience, the habit of noticing details other people ignored. Sometimes it still surprised her how much of his father remained inside him. Before she could say anything else, a white airport vehicle began moving slowly toward the fence. Its flashing safety beacon reflected against the pavement. Elijah frowned. Several airport employees turned to watch. The vehicle stopped a few yards away. The driver stepped out first. Then another figure emerged from the passenger side. Tall, gray-haired, airline uniform. Captain Richard Collins. Elijah immediately felt his stomach tighten. Ruth straightened beside him. Collins paused for a moment before approaching. The confident pilot who had laughed earlier seemed different now. More thoughtful, more careful. He stopped several feet away and looked directly at Elijah. Neither spoke at first. The evening breeze stirred across the fence between them. Finally, Collins broke the silence. "You heard something before any of us did." Elijah lowered his eyes briefly. "Yes, sir." Collins nodded slowly. "The engineers confirmed there was a problem." Ruth glanced from the captain to her grandson. Elijah remained quiet. He was not sure what to say. Collins studied the teenager for another moment. Then he asked the question that had been bothering him ever since the alarm sounded. "How did you know?" The question lingered in the air between them. Beyond the fence, the airport seemed quieter now. The rush of the afternoon had softened into the steady rhythm of evening operations. Golden sunlight reflected from terminal windows. A distant aircraft climbed into the sky, its lights blinking against the fading blue. Elijah looked down at the cracked pavement beneath his sneakers. For a moment, he seemed unsure whether he should answer at all. Then he reached into his backpack and pulled out an old pair of headphones. The black plastic was worn smooth from years of use. One side had been repaired with a strip of faded tape. Captain Collins glanced at them curiously. Elijah turned the headphones over in his hands. "My father taught me," he said quietly. Collins remained silent. Ruth lowered her eyes. Even after all these years, hearing Marcus mentioned still carried a weight that never completely faded. Elijah stared toward the aircraft parked at the gate. He was an engineer. His voice remained calm, but something deeper moved beneath the words. "When I was little, he used to play recordings of engines for me. Different sounds, different conditions. He said if I listened carefully enough, I could hear when something was wrong." A gentle breeze moved across the airport. Collins folded his arms and listened. Not as a captain, not as an expert, simply as a man. "Most people hear noise," Elijah continued. "My father heard patterns." He looked at the headphones again. "He taught me how to hear them too." For several seconds, nobody spoke. The distant hum of ground equipment drifted across the tarmac. Somewhere nearby, a service truck reversed, its warning tone echoing faintly through the evening air. Collins noticed the teenager was not trying to impress anyone. There was no pride in his voice. No attempt to prove himself. Just honesty. Pure and simple. "Your father sounds like he was a remarkable man," Collins said. Elijah nodded. "He was." The answer came immediately, without hesitation. Ruth smiled softly. The sunlight caught the corners of her eyes. "Marcus loved airplanes," she said. "Sometimes I think he loved teaching even more." Elijah managed a small smile. "The first one all afternoon." Collins glanced toward the aircraft once more. The maintenance crews were still working. Flashlights glimmered beneath the engine housing. Every now and then a reflective vest caught the light like a brief spark. He thought about the countless hours he had spent trusting instruments, procedures, and experience. All valuable things. All necessary things. Yet today, before any warning system reacted, before any computer identified a fault, a 13-year-old boy had simply listened. The realization settled heavily in his chest. Not as embarrassment, not as guilt, as perspective. The fading sunlight painted the runway in shades of amber and gold. For a few quiet moments, nobody rushed to fill the silence. Elijah stood beside his grandmother. Colin stood on the opposite side of the fence. The airport continued moving around them, but the noise felt distant now. Small, almost unimportant. Because somewhere between a warning alarm and an old pair of headphones, three people had found themselves thinking about the same thing. How often the world overlooks the voices that deserve to be heard the most. Daniel Ross returned nearly 20 minutes later carrying a thin maintenance folder tucked beneath one arm. The sky above Charlotte had shifted into deeper shades of orange and blue, and the first runway lights were beginning to glow. As he approached the fence, his expression was different from before. Not concerned, not hurried, thoughtful. He stopped beside Captain Collins and opened the folder. "I found something unusual," he said. Collins glanced at the documents. "Related to the engine?" Daniel nodded. "Related to the maintenance history." He flipped through several pages before stopping near the middle. The calibration tool that was left inside the housing should never have been there. According to procedure, it was checked out and returned 3 years ago. Collins frowned. 3 years. That is what caught my attention. Daniel pointed to a faded signature on one of the forms. "Look at the name." Collins leaned closer. For a moment, he simply stared. Then his eyes widened slightly. The signature at the bottom of the page read Marcus Carter. Elijah felt his breath catch. Ruth covered her mouth. The evening air suddenly felt very still. Daniel carefully turned another page. 3 years before his accident, Marcus identified a flaw in the tracking process for specialized calibration equipment. He submitted a report recommending changes. Collins looked up. Were the changes made? Daniel shook his head. Not immediately. He paused. The recommendations were eventually adopted, but not until much later. Elijah stared at the paperwork. His father's name sat there in dark ink as if no time had passed at all. Daniel continued. "What is remarkable is that the exact concern Marcus raised involved misplaced tools during maintenance procedures." Collins slowly exhaled. The coincidence felt almost impossible. The same type of issue. The same warning. Years apart. Yet somehow connected. Daniel handed the folder to Elijah. "Your father was ahead of a lot of people," he said quietly. "Most never knew it." Elijah ran his fingers lightly across the edge of the paper. He had spent years hearing stories about his father at home. Stories from family. Stories from old friends. But this was different. This was proof. Real evidence that Marcus Carter's work still mattered. That his voice still echoed through the industry he loved. Collins looked toward the parked aircraft. Maintenance lights reflected across the polished fuselage. Hundreds of passengers would never know what had happened today. They would never know how close the flight had come to departing with a hidden problem. And they would never know that the first person to recognize it was standing beside a fence with a worn pair of headphones in his backpack. Collins looked back at Elijah. The teenager who had been dismissed as a curious kid only hours earlier now seemed impossible to overlook. Not because he had predicted an alarm. Not because he had been lucky, but because he had inherited something rare. The patience to listen, the courage to speak, and the wisdom to trust what he heard. For several moments nobody spoke. The maintenance folder rested in Elijah's hands while the evening light continued fading across the airport. The pages felt heavier than paper should have felt. They carried proof of something he had always believed but had never been able to show the world. His father had mattered. His work had mattered. Captain Collins looked at the teenager and felt an unexpected sense of humility settle over him. Earlier that day, he had dismissed Elijah with a smile and a laugh. Not out of cruelty, but out of certainty. The certainty that experience always knew best. Now that certainty seemed much smaller than it had a few hours ago. Collins stepped closer to the fence. The metal links cast long shadows across the pavement between them. "Elijah," he said quietly. The boy looked up. "Yes, sir." Collins paused. Airline workers, technicians, and supervisors moved in the background, but none of that seemed important now. "I owe you an apology." Elijah blinked. The word surprised him. Collins continued. "When you tried to warn us, I did not listen. I assumed I knew more because I had more years in the cockpit." The captain glanced briefly toward the aircraft. "Today you reminded me that wisdom does not always arrive wearing a uniform." Ruth smiled softly. Daniel Ross folded his arms and nodded in agreement. Elijah shifted awkwardly. He was not used to being the center of attention. "I was just trying to help," he said. Collins smiled. "That is exactly the point." The answer seemed to linger in the cool evening air. Most people would have stayed quiet. Most people would have assumed someone else would notice the problem. Elijah had spoken up anyway. Not because it would benefit him. Not because he wanted recognition. Simply because he believed it was the right thing to do. Daniel reached into his jacket pocket and removed a small laminated airport visitor pass. "This is temporary," he said with a grin. "But if your grandmother approves, I would like to show you something next weekend." Elijah looked at the pass. "What is it?" "A maintenance facility tour." Daniel's eyes brightened. "The real one, not the public version." Elijah's face lit up instantly. Ruth laughed softly for the first time all day. "I think his answer is yes." Nearby, several technicians chuckled. The tension that had surrounded the aircraft for hours finally began to dissolve. Collins looked toward the fading horizon. The first stars were beginning to appear above the airport. "Your father would be proud of you," he said. Elijah lowered his eyes for a moment. Of all the things he had heard that evening, those words affected him the most. He swallowed hard and nodded quietly. The maintenance lights continued glowing around the aircraft while crews prepared final inspections. The problem had been found. The danger had passed. Yet something else had happened that day as well. A forgotten engineer's voice had been heard again through the actions of his son. And for everyone standing near that fence, that realization felt even more important than the alarm that had started it all. 1 week later, the airport looked different to Elijah Carter. Not because the runways had changed or the aircraft were any larger than before. It felt different because for the first time, people who had once hurried past him now stopped to say hello. The maintenance facility tour Daniel Ross promised had become something much more meaningful. Engineers showed Elijah diagnostic systems. Technicians explained inspection procedures. Mechanics answered every question he asked. The enormous hangar smelled of machine oil, polished metal, and fresh paint. Sunlight streamed through high windows and reflected across aircraft wings parked inside like giant mirrors. Yet the moment Elijah remembered most happened near the end of the visit. Daniel led him and Ruth toward a conference room overlooking the maintenance floor. Through the glass walls, crews continued working below. On one side of the room stood a framed display that had not been there before. Elijah stopped walking. His eyes widened. Inside the frame was a photograph of Marcus Carter wearing safety glasses and smiling beside an aircraft engine. Beneath the picture sat a brass plaque. The inscription was simple. "In recognition of Marcus Carter, whose commitment to safety continues to guide those who listen." Elijah stared at the words without speaking. Ruth pressed a hand gently against her chest. Her eyes glistened in the afternoon light. Daniel stepped back quietly. Captain Collins stood nearby as well, having arrived shortly before the presentation. Neither man interrupted the moment. Some silences deserved respect. Elijah slowly stepped closer to the display. His reflection appeared faintly in the glass beside his father's photograph. For a brief second, the resemblance felt impossible to ignore. The same thoughtful eyes, the same calm expression, the same quiet determination. Collins folded his hands behind his back. "Your father helped protect people he would never meet," he said softly. "And last week, so did you." Elijah looked at the photograph again. The noise of the hangar seemed distant now. Forklifts moved below. Radios crackled. Tools clicked against metal surfaces. Life continued. Yet somehow everything felt still. He reached out and rested his fingertips lightly against the frame. Not because he was sad. Not because he missed his father any less. But because for the first time, he understood something important. Legacy was not about being famous. It was not about having your name remembered by everyone. It was about leaving behind something good that continued helping people long after you were gone. Outside the hangar, an aircraft accelerated down the runway and lifted gracefully into the bright Carolina sky. Sunlight flashed across its wings before it disappeared into the clouds. Elijah watched through the window until it became a tiny silver dot in the distance. Then he smiled. Somewhere above those clouds, thousands of travelers were trusting people they would never know. Pilots, engineers, mechanics, inspectors. And thanks to lessons passed from one generation to another, that trust remained strong. The afternoon light settled across the photograph one last time as Elijah stood quietly beside it. No speeches followed. No applause filled the room. Only the soft hum of airplanes, the warmth of sunlight through glass, and the peaceful certainty that some voices never truly fade away.